Hey everyone, it is time for another recitation, this time on React testing. So, our project for today is to implement and test a React application. This time it's a scoreboard for a baseball game. So the goal for our application is that we should have a scoreboard and some buttons, and we should be able to keep track of the pitch count. So there should be a button for strikes, button for balls, fouls, and hit, and it should update, the batter's count of how many strikes and balls they have when we hit the appropriate buttons. We also want to test it. We want to test any individual components that we write, which as far as the project tells us we can do in whatever way we choose, as well as testing the entire application, that it works from the user's perspective. And that's what we're going to do. So the first step, I already have my React server running. I need to add the React testing library as a development dependency, which is going to look a little bit different if you're on NPM, but I'm just adding the @testing library -react as a development dependency. And while that's installing, I am going to fire up my painting program, and we're going to talk a little bit about architecting this app, because this is a really important part of testing, is trying to write code that's easy to test. Because code that is easy to test is generally easier to reason about and easier to compose and reuse. So a good reusable component should be a good testable component and vice versa. And what do I mean by this? Well, when we write a component, we usually want it to be dumb. We want it to have one purpose. Usually take props in and show data, out. Or, maybe it has some buttons, and when we click on the buttons, they do things. What do the buttons do? I don't know. They just do something. So when I'm architecting this app, let's get a box. So this is going to be my my app JS, and it's going to contain my entire application. I know this is going to need some state. The things we're going to need to keep track of is balls and strikes. And I'm going to need two more things. I'm going to need my my display, right? And my display.js. All this is going to do is display balls and strikes. So, I'm going to have strikes, and then, that in a little box, and same thing for balls. And it can just take these in via props. It doesn't need to know anything about how balls and strikes work. We can just connect the state in my app to the display via props. So now display is a very, very dumb reusable component. It just takes in balls and strikes via props and then displays them. That's going to make it really easy to test, because when I render it, I can give it balls and strikes as props and check and see with getByText if they show up inside of our component. Boom, easy testing. Okay, so then now I'm going to need another component, and this is going to be my controls. This is going to contain my 4 buttons. One for my strikes, balls, fouls, and hits. And this is where our architecture really comes into play, because I could do this directly in app.js, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to write functions that, count for when a strike happens, a ball happens, a foul happens, and when a hit happens. And I'm going to pass them in via props to controls.js. So my controls isn't aware of the logic behind a strike, a ball, a foul, or a hit. It's just aware that it has 4 buttons. And when they're clicked on, it should execute these functions that it's being passed in. So now my control is also very easy to test. All I need to test is that when I click a button, my function gets called. So then I'm going to have to test the entire app.js, and this is where it gets harder. This is where we have essentially an integration test between these different components. Now I have to worry about state. And I'm not going to write any tests that care about the implementation inside of my app.js. I'm not going to care that I did use state or if I wrote a class-based component or whatever. For the purposes of my testing, that's irrelevant. I want to test from the perspective of a user. I want to recreate the manual testing I would do to make sure that my app is working. And what would that be? Well, I'd open the page, I would find the button that says strikes, I'd click on it, I'd see that the strikes counter went up, I'd click on it a couple more times to check and see if strikes rolled over and that it reset the other ones. I'd do the same things for balls, fouls, hits. That's what I want to do. Does it matter how I have that state stored from the perspective of me manually testing it? No. No, it explicitly doesn't. Because the idea behind my testing is I write these tests that say what the correct behavior is, not what the correct implementation is. That way, if down the road, let's say this was an old class-based component, and now I want to rewrite it in a functional component with hooks. Well, I should be able to tear out the old implementation, put in my new one, and from the test perspective, there'd be no difference because they should behave exactly the same. The user shouldn't care whether or not they're made with hooks. And so that's
Henry?
Oh, yes.
Henry, it looks like you forgot to hit record.
I don't do my recording on Zoom. I do it with an outside program. So,
Okay.
yes.
Okay.
No, thank you. I appreciate the concern. No, there will be a
Internet
recording.
about to shut down.
Oh,
Okay,
all
thank
right.
you.
Yeah,
Carry on.
great. So our testing in our whole app situation, in our integration test, should not be aware of the implementation. And that's good, because when we change the implementation, we shouldn't break the user experience. And that's exactly what that test is there to codify. So let's check and see if my dependency finished installing. Okay, it did. And let me restart my Yarn server just in case. So I have just a bare create React app up. Nothing here. If I go into my source, it's literally just the default minus our SVG and our service worker. So we talked today about test-driven development, and I really enjoy test-driven development. I like writing the rules, before I start writing my implementation because it helps me clarify what I want to do. But speaking honestly, test-driven development isn't great if you don't already know what you're going to do. Because I talked about these decisions of architecturing, but from the perspective of most of us, we're not going to be able to sit down and be like, yes, I shall do this, and it shall be perfect. We're going to start writing our components and try to figure these things out as we go. So today, I am going to write my components first and then my tests second. But what I'm not going to do is write my entire application and then write my tests. I'm going to do these one at a time. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to make a components folder, and then I am going to make my display component, because that should be the simplest one. I'm going to import React from React. I'm going to define my component. I'm going to return just an empty div for now. It'll say display in here, so I can visually check if it's working. And then I'm going to export my display. Right. So then I'm going to pop into my app.js and try to get this rendered on my screen. So I'm going to import display from /components/display, and then I'm going to render this. Okay, so the idea behind my display is that I should be able to have some state in my app that keeps track of my balls and my strikes, and the display should display that. I want to keep the presentation separate from my logic. So what I'm going to do with my display, I'm just going to make this very, very simple. I'm going to have a div that's going to say strikes, and then it's going to display props.strikes, and then I'm going to do the same thing for balls. That's it. And right now, that's just going to come up as this kind of empty thing because I haven't given it any values. So an app, let me test this. I'm going to give it 2 strikes and 3 balls. It's full count. Okay, so that didn't work. Oh, it's because I misspelled strike. This should be strikes. So this exact thing that I did here of manually testing it, this is the behavior that I want to codify into my test. Because we do this testing naturally, right? We should progressively, as we're building our app, check. We should write our code, we should check the browser, make sure it's all good. The idea is that we want to capture this behavior and automate it so that later I don't have to, when I'm messing with the state implementation of my app, be concerned that I'm breaking display. I should already know exactly how display works and be guaranteed with my automated testing that display works the way I expect it. So let's write our tests for display. So I'm going to go into my components folder. I'm going to create a file called display.test.js, and then I'm going to do my imports. I'm going to import React from React. I'm going to import the render function from my React testing library, which is going to be at testing library /React. And then I'm going to import my component. So I'm going to import display from /display.js. And now I'm ready to write my tests. So I would do this inside a describe block. And right now my editor is yelling at me, and it's telling me that describe isn't defined. It technically isn't, at least in the scope, but the way that we have our testing set up, describe and it and the other things that Jest, our testing framework, normally provides, will all be defined inside the environment where the tests are run. So I don't have to worry about that. And then I'm going to call this display. Then in here, I can write any of the tests that I want. So let's write a basic test, renders without crashing. So what we're going to do here is we're going to use our render function, and we are going to render our display component. So then now I actually have to run my tests. So I'm going to open up my terminal, not this one, the other one. Then I'm going to run yarn test, which is going to start up our testing scripts. So that should pick up our test and display .test.js. Yes, and it passes. All right, so now I want to write another test. Should probably name it better than me. I'm just going to call it props work. And what I want to do is I want to check and see if it works when I render props to it. So when I render display with the strikes set to 2 and the balls set to 3, does that display visually correctly on my screen? And the way I do this is I can save the output of this render into a variable. And then I can call display.getByText. Wait, is that right? I always forget the names of things. Yes, getByText. And then I can get an element by its text content. I can also do this via destructuring, because display, this value here, is going to be an object. So if I wanted to, I could extract the getByText function out of display like so, and then I can just call getByText. I can also combine this into a single step, where I can just directly destructure getByText out of here. For now, here, I'm going to define my display variable, and then get to work on testing it like this, and I'll do it the destructuring way in the next file. So what I want to do is I want to find the component that has strikes colon 2, because that's what it should be, right? If I give it 2 as a value of the strikes prop, then I should be able to find on the page strikes colon 2. Same thing with balls, but 3. And our testing suite is going to rerun, and there we go. All our tests pass. You should be suspicious of this. If you write a new test and it passes right away, you shouldn't be like, yep, good to go. You should always try to make it fail to make sure that it's working. So let's check with the text for balls being balls colon 2. Okay, now our test fails. And I don't have to expect the results of getByText, because if it can't find it, it's going to throw an error. So my test fails, and we know where it was. So this is good. For consistency's sake, just in case the strikes and balls were hard-coded as 2 and 3, we should probably check another value for these to make sure that it works with additional values. And then we should probably try and check our edge cases. So I'm going to check if the component is dumb. So what if I render strikes as -2 and balls as 400? And that test is also going to pass, because we know the way display is implemented. It's just going to render our props to the screen. And is this behavior important? Not really. But part of the idea behind testing is to clarify this kind of edge behavior. Because if it changes in the future, we might not realize it when we're thinking through the logic on our own. But if we change it and then a test fails, we know, oh, okay, this has changed. I can fix the test, but maybe I should make sure some part of my application doesn't depend on the component behaving in this weird way. So tests are there to help us clarify and notice things. In this case, it's fine if this component is dumb, but I should probably write a test to verify that it is dumb. So do we have any questions at this point?
Yeah, Henry. For the messages, are those error messages, or what are they?
Yes, that's an error. If getByText doesn't return a result, then it throws an error. So let's trigger one. Let's put strikes to 4 here, and then when our test suite reruns, this throws an error. And it says, it gives us the error message, unable to find an element with the text strikes 4. This could be because blah, 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 blah. So we could write an additional, different string to try to find it, or try to match our data up. And it actually prints to us the shape of this component and shows us the line that this happened. This line threw an error. If I wanted to, I could wrap this in an expect, and I think it would handle the error a little bit cleaner. But we don't need an expect. Yeah, it does basically the same thing. Still throws an error, which is fine.
Also, is there a difference between the libraries at testing versus testing React library or React testing library?
I believe this is the most up-to-date version of this library. I have their GitHub repo pulled up. I believe Amir is asking because when we went through this, we installed a different dependency, but I believe this, the @testing library -react, is the way to get the most up-to-date version of this dependency. So That's
Is
what the
that
repo
different from
says.
Jest?
Yes. So Jest is a testing framework. Jest is the thing that defines describe, it, expect. Those are all things from Jest. We can use Jest to test any type of JavaScript that we want. React Testing Library gives us some tools to test React components, like the ability to render a component. This comes from the React Testing Library. Jest doesn't have that feature because Jest doesn't know or really care what React is. Jest just cares about giving us functions that we can write tests with. But we use React Testing Library so we can render our components and then search them for text inside of them or perform other actions to interact with our React application that just is really outside of its purview. Does that answer your question?
What does the @ sign in front of the import mean?
I don't know if it actually works the way I'm about to say it. In a lot of other languages, dependencies are namespaced. So we wouldn't just like install React Router. And I'm sure you've run into this issue where you've slightly mistyped the name of a dependency and you don't get an error because someone else has a thing called like Axios, which I've installed an uncountable number of times. So in a lot of other languages, components they're not just like, I'm sorry, dependencies aren't just named whatever. If I published a library, it would be called like, blevs / React Router. And this would be different than like, the React training, which is the people who make React Router, from their React Router package. So you wouldn't get into this issue where like people, essentially domain squat on NPM package names. And like, no shade on React Router, but part of their success has been the ability that they were able to get the package name React Router, so they show up really highly in the in the Google searches. So I believe that's what's going on here with the @ testing library. I do not believe that namespacing actually exists on NPM as far as I'm aware, but I think that is what is trying to happen here. So you may have also noticed this if you ever used, what's it called again? Font Awesome. They also have their packages under like a namespace as well, which is called Fort Awesome, which is incredibly confusing.
I was always wondering about that. Why is it called Fort Awesome?
Yeah, I have no idea, but yeah, it's so easy to see that R is an N and causes hours and hours worth of problems. So, any other questions here?
Yeah, a quick one, Henry. Can you just say super high level what's going on in props work test? Is it really is it as simple as it looks? You're just trying to pass down props where strikes are 2 and balls are 3, and then you just want to know if it actually displayed in the next 2 lines. That's it?
Yeah, what I'm literally trying to do is when I did my visual testing here, when I go into app.js, I gave my display 2 strikes and 3 balls, and then I checked my web page that it says strikes 2 and balls 3. And so I'm literally writing that with code at this point, that I want to check and see. I want to render my thing with the props I've given it, and then I want to check if it contains the text. This should be 2 if we weren't trying to trigger that error. And then I do it again with these different props. That's all I'm doing. Simple as that, because display should be a very dumb component. Props in, JSX out. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Why are you indicating strikes 2, balls 3 in both spots, in display and in the test?
Because what I'm doing here is I am rendering the component with the props, and then here I have to test that it contains the text that should appear given those props. And then I'm doing it again with different values here and different values here. So this is my setup, and then this is my test.
I think I see it. So that whatever you're doing, I can't tell which window is on top. But the strikes equals 2 and the top display, that's not getting fed into
No. This is my app. This is my app. Here, what I'm testing is literally I am rendering the display with these arbitrary props. I can remove this, and all of my tests are still going to pass. Because in the magic test runner land, it's performing this, where it renders my display and then checks it for text. Yeah.
So why would you have to import the component into the test file then, if it doesn't care about the actual components?
Well, it does care about the actual component. It doesn't care about app, but I want to use display. Like here, I literally write how I would render display as JSX. So I need to import display in order to use it. And I can import other components in here if I wanted to. But if I want to use display, I have to import it.
And another question on the argument to get by text. Dustin was mentioning you could actually wrap it in quotes, as opposed to this. What is this, regex?
Yeah, I wanted to touch on this. So this is called a regular expression, and you can Google it, and there's lots of information out there, and I'll even show you a little bit of the powerful stuff you can do with it. But the idea behind a regular expression is that it's basically a very tiny, compact, domain-specific language for matching patterns within text. So, for example, if I wanted to match like any number here, I could replace this with this specific thing I'm allowed to do in regular expression, which is 0 to 9 inside these square brackets, and it would match in that position any number, 0 to 9. So it allows me to express very powerfully patterns that I would expect to see within text. And this will work. It's not a good test because I want to know if the specific number shows up or not. But I'm allowed to do that inside my regular expression. The problem is, and what I wanted to touch on, is that I have these hard-coded number 2 and 3 here, and I have it here. As a good programmer, I should want to put these in variables and reuse them. That way they're, easier to change and track down. But the problem is, so let's set balls as 3 and strikes as 2, and then easily enough, I can use them in here. But I can't use them inside my regular expression. I cannot do something like this, because this is not a template string. Regular expression has enough going on as far as what these special characters mean. So instead, what I do is this syntax with these slashes, this would be called a regular expression literal, in the same way that square braces with stuff inside of them. This is a literal array. There's also an array class we can use, and these lines of code are essentially exactly the same. This is just the more convenient syntax to write it in. We also have the ability to construct regular expressions this way. So I could make a new regular expression. That should be defined. Did I type it wrong? Let me check my notes. Oh, it's regexp. And then it expects as its first argument the string that is going to form the regular expression, and then as its second argument any options. Like I is for case insensitivity. And so in here I could make a template string and do like strikes and then use my template string stuff. And now I have the ability to create a regular expression with variables in it. And I can do the same thing with balls. Yeah, I don't have hard-coded numbers. And I still get to use all the powers of my regular expressions if I were choosing to do so, which I am not. But that's how we create dynamic regular expressions. I'd encourage you to go and read the MDN page about regular expressions or any other resource that you find. They're very interesting. All right, any more questions here?
How would you go if you styled strikes and the number into different div?
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
Yeah, sorry. So how would you go about if you style like strikes and the value in two different divs? Like if you can't really,
Oh,
like if there are two different divs, like how would you check for the text? Is there a way to like access a specific div?
if they're in two different divs, you can, let me break this real fast. Our error message gives us pretty good hints, actually. So this could be because the test is broken up into multiple elements. In this case, you can provide a function for your text matcher that will make your matcher more flexible. So we can look up how to do React testing library matcher function or across multiple things. And there will be some nice documentation for how to do this. There's also other things we can do, like we don't have to get by text. We can get by other types of queries. We can get by label text and then examine properties of the element that we've gotten. But let's see, React testing library. I'm not finding the exact thing that I want right now. Across multiple elements. Let me get back to you on this.
Yeah, sure thing.
Okay. Yeah. But there are ways around it. Okay. So, any other questions? All right. Well, then we are going to move forward and do our controls. Because what I want is to, let me actually put my display back in here. I want to create a component that just displays my 4 buttons, and when those buttons are clicked on, they trigger a function. Do the buttons care what that function is? No, they do not. I'm writing a dumb component that's easy to test. So I'm going to go into my components file, and I'm going to create controls.js. I'm going to import React from React. I'm going to define my components. I'm going to return an empty div and export this. And then I will render it inside of my app just to make sure it's working. So then import controls from components controls. Okay, and then what I want this to do, very simple. I want to make a bunch of buttons. I want to make strike, and then ball, foul, and hit. And what I want these to do is when they're clicked on click, I want them to call a function props dot something. I'll just go down the line. Strike, ball, foul, not fall, and hit. So now I have these buttons that when clicked on, they will call functions. And then what would I do if I wanted to check and see that this worked? Well, I would do something like, let's give this a prop called strike, and let's just write a function that console logs strike. Right, because I'm not testing my state or the logic yet. I just want to make sure that when I click on this button, it works. So let's see. Yep, works. Okay, so now I want to codify exactly what I manually did so that I can automate it and repeat it. I just want to test that these functions are fired when I click on each of the buttons. So that's what we're going to do. I am going to go into my components file, and I'm going to create the testing file for controls. So controls.test.js. I am just going to steal my imports from my other test file because I don't want to rewrite them. And then, yeah, let's work with this. So I'm going to do my describe as controls. I'm also going to need to change this. Instead of display, I want to import controls. And then I'm going to start writing my tests. So first one, as always, renders without crashing. I am going to render controls. And let me check and see if my test did their thing. Yay, it passed. Okay, so now I can actually go about testing these buttons. So I'm going to do something pretty similar to my old test. I'm going to render controls. I'm going to save this into a variable. This time I'm going to shortcut it, and I'm just going to destructure the getByText function directly out of the object that is generated on my right-hand side, because I don't really need to access, that component. I just need this getByText function. And then I want to get one of my buttons. So let's do getByText, and let's get strike. Okay, so wait, why did this not actually work? Oh, because this needs to be a regular expression. So my test rerun. Why is this still crashing? Multiple elements found with the text. That shouldn't be the case. I know I'm not cleaning up between these, but I wouldn't expect that to be an issue. It might be. If I do it like this, does it matter? I would learn something interesting today if this were the case. Okay, so this doesn't matter. What? It appears to be rendering everything twice. Okay, so it must be an issue with me not cleaning up, right? It shouldn't, because I am just rendering controls. I am not also rendering the display. See how here it's rendered everything twice? I believe what the issue is that what happens if I comment out this? Yes, okay. So the issue is with me not cleaning up between each one of my renders. So as I render this to like this fake testing DOM, I'm not isolating these tests between each other, so this is showing up more than once. So my issue is that I need to kind of clear that DOM in between each one of my renders. And luckily, there is a way to do that. And it's part of the testing library. I just have to import it at testing library /react/cleanup after each. And notice that I'm not importing this into any variable name. because when I import this, it will run this file for me, and this file sets it up so that after I finish each text, my testing DOM is cleared, and I am free to render another application. So now all of my tests pass because I'm not getting that double rendering occurring. So, neat bug. Okay, so now I have my button. And I'm not sure exactly what to do with it. Did someone unmute themselves to ask a question?
Yeah, that was me. Inside your describe, I know that earlier today we had it as calculator.js. Well, you know, or that's we put like the component name and then .js, and I noticed that you have it in the little. Yeah, that's how we were doing it earlier.
Yeah, this does not matter. This is just a string that we're labeling this test with. So when it fails, it will tell us this name, so I'll know which test failed. So
gotcha.
Like, if I deliberately fail this one, and we watch in my test rerunner, if I scroll up, it will say that, okay, so in the controls describe block, the strike test failed.
Gotcha.
And that's why good names are important, but I can call it whatever I want. So I have my button, and at this point I'm not really sure what to do with it, because we didn't entirely cover this today. I want to click on it, and the way we do that is React Testing Library offers us this function, fire event, that lets us interact with DOM elements and do things like click on them. So if I do fire event, it has a method called click, and I can give it my strike button, and this will click on my button. However, my button isn't currently set up to do anything when clicked on because I didn't pass any props to my controls. So let me change that. I'm going to use the exact same thing I did in my app.js. I'm just going to give it a function that when clicked will console log strike. And we can actually see this happen. It literally console logs strike because we clicked the button and it runs that code and it prints that log to our console, which is pretty cool. Not that helpful for determining if this test passed or not, but neat all the same. We can console log from tests and they show up in our test runner. So instead, what I want to do is I want to figure out if this function that I passed as the strike prop actually completed or not. So there's a homegrown solution that, I don't know, some of you may have like figured this out today, where I can make this let variable, it's called clicked, and set it equal to false. And then I can give a callback function to strike that will set clicked to be equal to true. And now, after I click this, the value of click should be true. So I can expect clicked to be true. And this test passes. And let's double check. What if I change the name of this to something to make this test deliberately fail? Yep. So we expected it to be true, but instead we received false. So this is a neat trick to figure out if our function was run. However, there's a bit more of an official way to do this. We also didn't talk about this, but while I have you, I'm gonna show you. And that is our Jest mock functions. So Jest, our testing library, comes with a bunch of cool tools to enable us to test things. So I'll just write this two ways. That's how you spell part do, right? I know French. So Jest gives us this ability to make fake functions and then learn things about them, when they're called, what arguments they were given when they're called, and it lets us easily create mocked functions. So I can make a function called click, and I would make that with jest.fn. And you can read all about this in the Jest docs, where we have all of this stuff about mocking functions. So we make it with jest.fn, and then I can pass it to my component as a prop. And then instead of caring about this clicked, I can expect click to be called. So I can expect my function to be called. And this is essentially a formalization of the little trick I showed you with less. But now we have a bit more of an official way to describe if our function has been called or not. And this test passes. I'm going to rename this. So I can continue, and I can do this with all of my other buttons. And I can copy and paste this and change this. Instead of strike, we're just going to do this to ball, and this will work. And I can continue copy and pasting. And it's at this point that your dev senses might be tingling, that I shouldn't be doing copy and pasting. This is where we should start to abstract things. And you're both right and wrong. So this is where the art of testing becomes very subtle and opinionated. I'm sure most of you have seen the meme at this point where it's, spend hours debugging your code and then realize the bug is in the test. The more complicated we make our testing functions, the more likely we are going to have a bug in them. Whereas this is incredibly straightforward. Is it long, and is it copy and pasted a whole bunch of times? Yes. And so there is a drawback there in that it's less maintainable, because if we want to change one of these tests, now we have to go and change all of them. But it's very explicit. Dustin mentioned today that tests serve as documentation. I can go into this test file and I can read this, and I can see that we pass a function to this prop, that we click on the button, and then we should have called that function. Right? It's very clear to me what's happening here. And I'm going to share to you what I wrote when I originally did this project, because I am insufferable and desire to be clever. This tests all the buttons. What does this do? None of you are done reading it at this point. And that makes it, in many ways, a bad test, because you're going to have to decipher the logic I used to test these buttons. Now, is it efficient as far as lines of code goes? You betcha. Would it be easy to, change and extend if certain things changed? Yeah, probably. But it doesn't serve as good documentation because it's complicated. And so we have to walk this fine line between using our skills to write, clean, maintainable, dry code with writing overcomplicated tests that can obscure what they're actually trying to do. So I will include this as an exercise for the reader in the code. But here, probably a good middle solution would be to try to abstract the common parts of this out into a function, and then call it and give it each button as an argument, maybe. That might be a good middle ground for getting this test to work. But for now, I am just going to copy and paste for the remaining buttons. So ball becomes foul, and foul becomes hit. Awesome. And all of my tests pass. No, they don't. Oh, I forgot something when I was finding and replacing text. So this should be hit, and this should be foul. And that's good there. Okay, and now all of my tests should pass. There we go, all my tests pass. So all of these buttons work. When they're clicked on, they run their associated function. Nothing more, nothing less. I have a good testable component, And if I break this later, I won't be trying to stumble through my testing for my app.js where I'm trying to decode all the logic that's happening, and maybe it's this thing that I broke over here, or maybe my state management broke, or maybe when I refactored this function it didn't work. No, I'll know that I broke this exact thing. Maybe I renamed a prop and forgot to update that in app.js. You know, it's going to make it obvious to me where the breakage occurs. This may seem obvious to you, maybe not even worth testing that these buttons do the thing when they're clicked on, but it's going to save you a lot of headache. A lot of the value in testing is reading other people's code. And do you know who is an other person? You from 2 weeks ago. When you will walk into a code base and you need to modify things, if you don't have tests, you can never be sure you're not wildly breaking things. So tests are so necessary when we make changes. When we're implementing it, most of the value we get out of tests is clarifying what we mean and thinking about our architecture. But the true value in tests is when we go and we have to refactor code, we have to change code, and we can know exactly where and when we broke things. So we're only seeing the first half of the value of testing, and the second half is honestly much more gratifying when it comes up. So do we have any questions here?
Yeah, I have a question. I sort of missed what I was referring to when it says strike button equals get by text, strike/I.
I is for case insensitivity. So
okay.
If I decided to capitalize these buttons later, the test would still pass. Because, again, we're doing this from the perspective of a user. The user does not care if strike is capital or lowercase, but we do probably need it to contain that word.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. All right. Any other questions here? Okay. So now I'm going to implement the actual stateful logic. So part of my architecture has led me to a nice place. In making controls dumb, reusable, easily testable, whatever you want to call it, I've decided that controls should not contain the logic for what happens when a strike happens. So this helps protect us from this behavior that we may still have where we would want to pass in, you know, our set strike function, and then inside of controls write the logic for what happens when we already have 2 strikes and we have to clear the count. This logic should probably remain with an app, with that state. Control should be dumb. It should just be worried about firing a function when that button is clicked on. So that's what I want to implement now within my app. So let's get our state up in here. So I'm going to import useState from React, and I'm going to create 2 variables, strikes, and it's going to be 0 initially. And then let's do balls. Okay. So then now I can actually hook this up. I can display my strikes, and I can display my balls. And with reasonable confidence, I know that this is going to work because I already have my testing set up. Yay! And now I want to write the logic for what happens when we score a strike. And for now, I'm going to write it wrong, and then we're going to fix it. So I'm going to do const, let's do score strike, and it doesn't take any arguments. What it's going to do is it's going to set the value of strikes to be strikes plus 1. And is that correct as far as baseball goes? Nope. Same thing for balls. It's going to increase it by 1. So score ball. Let's do foul. And here, it's going to set the value of strikes to be 1 more. That is also not logically correct for the rules of baseball. But I just want to verify what I had done with my testing, that when I click on these buttons, they're going to do the appropriate things. And when we get a hit, we then clear our count. So strikes goes back to 0, and balls go back to 0. And let me pass these in as props. So strike is going to be score strike. Ball is going to be score ball. Foul is going to be score foul. And hit is going to be score hit. Is there a reason I decided to prefix these with score? Not really, except I don't... It gets kind of confusing when we have like strikes plural and strikes singular, and they're vastly different things in terms of, you know, representing a function, in terms of a variable. So it can be helpful just to kind of delineate these things. All right, now let's do our manual testing. When I click the strike, it goes up, ball goes up, foul strikes go up, hit clears the count. Phew, it's perfect. I'm done. Obviously not. If I were testing this, I would want to see that when I, you know, get 3 strikes, that it clears the count, because I've just struck out. But it hasn't. And so I want to keep this in mind, because this is the behavior that I want to encode in my automated tests, what I'm doing manually here to check out the logic. And I'm going to continue writing this to make it right. So what I want to do is, if strikes is equal to 2, then I want to do my fancy stuff. If strikes isn't equal to 2, well then I'm just going to give us another strike. But if it is, then I want to clear the count because I've just struck out. So I'm going to set strikes equal to 0, and I'm going to set balls equal to 0. So now I can test this, and it correctly rolls over. Awesome. And if I add some balls in there, that also sets back to 0. I want to remember that that's the behavior that I tried, and I want to encode that in my test. So let me correct this with a ball. So if balls is 3, then I want to clear the count. Otherwise, I want to increase the number of balls. So let me test this behavior again. I want to encode this into a test. I'm going to add some strikes. I'm going to get 3 balls, and my score should reset. So now with a foul ball, it should increase strikes, but if we're at 2 strikes, the count remains the same. So I'm just going to check if strikes does not equal 2. If it doesn't, then I increase my strikes. So if I'm at 2 strikes, foul does nothing. If I'm at less than that, then foul adds on. And I could be writing some safer logical operators, like maybe less than 2. What if strikes accidentally gets above 3? But for the purposes of this, it's fine. And then scoring a hit works. So now I have my logic all hooked up, and it works. And now when I write my integration test for my entire app, this is the behavior that I want to encode. Me checking to see if strikes clears the count, me checking to see if it clears any existing balls that were on the scoreboard, checking to see that foul doesn't cause our strike or our count to roll over, and checking to see that hit clears the count. Those are the tests that I want to write for app. And I'm going to do this entirely using getByText and firing click events. I am not going to test the individual logic of any of these functions, because as far as the user cares, it doesn't matter that these functions exist. Would it be a good idea to possibly pull out these functions into their own library and like have a function that, given a count, returns the updated count if a strike was stored? Yeah, then we could unit test those functions easily outside of the logic of the main app. But I'm not going to do that here. That's some complexity that I don't want to add. But this is what we should think about when we're testing, is how I can isolate the logic that makes it easy to test, because that makes it more reusable, right? Writing things that are easy to test has great ramifications in terms of the quality of our code. But let's write our tests. I'm going to jack this, and then I'm going to go into app.test.js, I'm going to paste this, and I'm going to delete everything they already have, because I don't really care. And I'm going to do my fancy find replace to replace all instances of controls with app. Awesome. So now I'm testing app.js. So let's take a look at our test runner. Okay, so that has passed. So we're good there. So now I want to, actually, before I start writing these tests, does anyone have any questions about the logic that I wrote to get these things to work inside of app.js? No? We all feel good with this? We all feel good with this pattern of writing the logic inside app.js, or at least not necessarily inside app.js, but where our state lives, and not letting that logic spill into our child components, because that's a really powerful pattern that I want you to repeat. Okay, so now let's write our tests. I'm going to write one big test, because there's a small issue of how we handle state carrying over. Because when I go to another test, I'm going to clean up, and I'm going to essentially unmount my app, and then I'm going to make a new one. And it's just going to involve me doing the legwork to, example, get the strikes up to 2 when I want to test the rollover, which I'm already going to do when I test, you know, the strikes button for it to work. So I'm going to take a shortcut here. I'm just going to write this all in one big test. Is that proper protocol? No, it isn't. We should probably break up our tests, but it requires a little bit of extra work, or perhaps some ingenuity as far as maybe not cleaning up after each. Maybe finding some other solution. Maybe we can have app take props to set the initial values of strikes and balls to make testing easier. I'm not going to worry about that right now. I'm just going to make one big test. So first thing I want to do is I want to render app, and I'm going to destructure out get by text. So now I have my app rendered inside of my test. I'm also going to get my buttons. I want to get the strike button, which I'm just going to call strike, and I'll do that with get by text, strike, I, and let's look at our test runner. Okay, so we've instantly run into an issue, and that's that when I try to get this strike, it's now getting this value here and this value down here. There's a lot of potential solutions to this. I could use some other get function to get it by some property that I've set on this button itself. And I would encourage you all to read the documentation for the React testing library, because we have a lot of get by functions that will let us do interesting things. For now, I'm actually going to exploit the abilities of my regular expression. The up caret represents the beginning of a block of text, usually a line, and the $sign represents the end of a line of text. So this will get exactly the word strike. And now my test passes. I heard someone unmute yourself. Was there a question?
Oh, I'm sorry, no.
Okay. All right. So this is a regular expression trick. And if this looks weird to you, which it should, encourage you to Google and read about regular expressions. But the up character represents the beginning of a piece of text, and the $sign represents the end. So this will allow me to get something that contains exactly the word strike. Nothing more, nothing less. And I'm going to do this as well for ball and for foul. I apologize for running into after hours time. We're almost done here. and then foul becomes hit. Alright, so now I have all of my buttons. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on them, and I'm going to test and see what happens. So I'm going to test that strike works. Ideally, I'd write this in another test, but I'm going to run into issues with the cleanup after each as I try to carry the state between these tests. Is it a good idea to carry state between tests? Usually not, but I'm being lazy here. So oh, did someone unmute themselves?
Yeah, I did. How did you actually place the up arrow on there? Because I did shift and control on my Mac, and it does not.
So this character, it's shift 6.
Shift 6?
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me. I'm looking down at the bottom. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, it is the up caret, not the up arrow. Which, conveniently for me in Vim, those are the keys that I hit to move to the beginning and the end of the line. Look at that. Okay, so I want to test that strike works. So I'm going to fire a click event on the strike button twice. So I'm going to do fire event dot click and then have it hit the strike button. Then I'm going to do that again. And now I'm going to get by text. And I'm going to look for strikes 2. Because what should happen is, after I hit the strike button twice, this should say strikes 2. So I'm encoding this into my test, the thing that I did manually, and it passes. Let's try and break it. Does it work with strikes 3? It does not. We cannot find that text. Alright, so then let's test that strike rolls over. Okay, so then let's fire another strike event, and then let's check that strikes are 0. Awesome. Maybe I also want to check if ball works. So instead, I am going to fire 3 click events on ball. And that also works. I should also check and see that balls is set to 0 here, and that our count correctly rolls over. And we can keep doing this, and ideally these would be in other tests. So let's check and see if ball rolls over the count. So we would fire, let's do 2 strike events, and then 3 ball events, and then a 4th ball event. And that should have our count be back to 0. And now, you know what, actually, I'm going to stop talking about that. No, I'm going to keep this in one big test. Don't do this in real life, though. And now I'm going to test that foul doesn't reset. Doesn't increase strikes past 2. So let's fire a foul event, and let's check that strikes is 1. Then let's check that it is 2 after another one, and let's check that it remains 2. And then let's also check that hit resets count. So I will fire a strike. I will fire a ball. And I will check that balls and strikes are now back to 0. Awesome. Oh, I forgot to fire my hit. Awesome. And notice how I'm not checking here that strikes and balls are 1. I shouldn't have to do that, because if that behavior didn't work, then one of my earlier tests would fail. So you can be extra sure and essentially retest your tests, but I can usually rely on my previous tests when I'm testing additional behavior. So I don't have to test that strike and ball worked, because I already did that. So, does anyone have any questions here? Come on, there's got to be a question.
I have a question, but it's about something you did earlier.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, and you had the same issue where in one of your earlier tests, you got the error found multiple events with the following text.
Mm-hmm.
I missed the moment where you went over how you fixed that bug.
Yeah, so the issue is that I will uncomment the line. Actually, I need to do it in the other file. That was in controls. I'll uncomment the line that fixed it, and we'll look at the interesting error that happens. Okay, so let me scroll up. Ooh, scrolling. Okay. So it tells us that we found multiple elements with the text strike, and if we look, it should print the elements that it was searching through. And you'll notice that inside this body tag is essentially our component, our controls component repeated. We see it once, and then we see it twice. The reason is because of how this render function for the React testing library works. If I wanted to, I could render multiple components into the same document if I wanted to test them like one above the other one. So when I render controls here, and then I render controls here, it actually shows up twice. If I don't want that behavior, then I can import this from React Testing Library, this cleanup after each, and this will set it up so that after every test is run, it totally clears that DOM and we're ready to render a new singular instance of our own component to test. The TK does it a little bit different, and thank you so much for bringing this up, because I wanted to mention this difference, because the way it's described in the training kit is that you import this function cleanup from React Testing Library, which is the function that performs the cleanup of the DOM. And then built into Jest is this function after each that we can give it a function, and it will run it after each test. There's also a before each, and these are really useful for setting up the environment that we want each test to run in. Let's say we want to set up, some other state, we might want to talk to some service, get everything cleared up. This is very essential when you do back-end testing with a database, that the database contains all the data that you want to work with. But the way I did it, where we import this file directly, or we import the cleanup function and then have it run after each or before each, also works, is also a valid way to avoid that multi-rendering problem. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. All right, any other questions?
Yeah, similarly, not quite related to what you have on the screen right now, but one of the issues that I ran into testing earlier was that it seems like my prop, anything that accesses props, comes in as undefined during testing. How do you actually pass props?
The exact same way. We pass props the exact same way we do normally. So on this line, I'm just rendering my controls component. But here, I'm rendering my controls component, and I'm giving it some props. we can just write any JSX we want inside of here when we're totally allowed to do that. So I can pass props to it, and I do that here as well. I pass this prop and this one, and in my display testing, we do the same thing. When I render my display component, I give it some props, just like normal. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think I had tried something like that earlier, but it still wasn't working for me, so I'm sure there's some other syntax thing that I'm missing somewhere.
Okay, I would make sure, because sometimes you have multiple tests failing and you'll fix one and the others will still fail and you haven't fixed it in there either, and that can be confusing. Or we can do console logs and they'll show up inside of our test runner. So maybe in our display component, we can console log props. And that will show up when we run the tests for display. And you can use that to try to help debug the situation that's going on. Yep, see? Here's my console logs. So, yeah. Can still use that same tool, the much valued console log. All right.
Cool. I'll just try some more stuff then. Thank you.
Great. Any other questions? Okay. Well, if that's it, then thank you all so much for coming. After Hours is happening in the After Hours channel if you all want to jump into there and continue talking about the joys of testing, which I really, truly enjoy. Actually, I'm going to hold you here for 1 minute. You can leave if you want to. I just want to talk about the value of testing, because you won't really appreciate it until it saves your life. When I did my backend build week, halfway through the week, I had to make a major change to the underlying database that I was working with. I'd switched the type of database that I was using, and it broke basically my entire application. Now, luckily, I had written tests for everything, so I was able to know what broke and in what way, and I was able to fix them one by one, and it was not a big deal at all. If I didn't have tests, it would have been an absolute nightmare, because I had just broken my whole application. I would have had to manually figure out what broke, where, in what layer, in what function, in what file, what was going wrong. But I had this beautiful output. It was blinking red and scary, but it was every test that failed and every value that it expected to be one way, and it got this instead. And from that moment on, I have vowed to myself that I will always write tests. I will leave the code a better place than I found it, because as soon as you have to change something, if you don't have tests, oh, it's going to hurt so bad. It's going to hurt so bad. So, write tests. Do it. You can tell.
In the context of like adding and subtracting, I feel like, and also like just trying to follow like all the syntax, I guess that's kind of been like my focus like today. But like in the I guess I kind of get how to test, or like how I would use it in the context of like addition and subtraction, but like in an actual like product where I was building some app, I wouldn't know what I would want to test.
Yeah. So there's.
Or I think it would take me some time to come up with.
Yeah.
How to implement that correctly. There's
a lot of different kinds of tests. The easiest ones to write and the most common ones are unit tests. And that's where we test those pure functions, like math. We give it input, it gives us output. We write the tests, and check that the input always equals the correct output. And we're good to go. What gets harder is these more advanced tests, like, testing these display things, the integration tests, where we're kind of testing all this functionality bundled together. My advice to you when you're in this situation is, if you find yourself checking something more than once, that should be a test. So like, as I was writing this, you probably went like, okay, strike, 2, okay, now it's back to 0. What if I add a ball, strike, okay, now that's back to 0. you're going to manually test your application as you write it. Just try to be aware of like the things you keep as you're trying to figure the logic out, the things you find yourself keep doing. If you do it more than once, it should probably be a test. You probably want to guarantee that that behavior works. This is also one of the reasons that test-driven development can help. If you write your tests first, like if I click this button, this should happen, then you write your implementation until the test passes. And that's another way to help think about this. Sit down and be like, all right, what do I want to do? I want it when I type in this form and hit enter, I want it to add a to-do. So I'm going to write a test that does that. And then I'm going to, write the actual code to implement that and then, keep fixing it until my test passes. So just watch out for what you do when manually testing. All right. Any other questions? Okay. Well then, thank you all so much for coming, and I'll probably see you in after hours in just a bit.